Okay, well, thank you for asking me to speak at this. There will be a fair amount of crossover between mine and Dr. Wilson's talk, so you guys are going to get a good dose of mastitis education today. But I will just get started. So just a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Washington State and did my undergrad at Washington State University in animal science. Did a PhD with none other than Dr. Wilson himself for an animal dairy veterinary sciences at Utah State University. And then I'm currently the lab director at Udder Health Systems, which I will introduce that company in a minute for those of you that are not familiar. So I've been working with mastitis and milk quality for the last 17 years, also currently serving on the board of directors for the National Mastitis Council. And I've worked as a lab analyst and milk quality specialist in the company before being the current lab director. So to introduce who Udder Health Systems is, there may be some participants on this that have used us for testing and are familiar. My dad is a veterinarian. He started the business in 1978, so we are over 40 years old. And the whole purpose was to produce milk quality, or to produce high quality milk and work in milk quality and mastitis prevention. He started it in Western Washington. We do still have a lab there in the Pacific Northwest, which is where I grew up. We have our two main labs. Our two largest labs are in Idaho, one in the greater Boise area and one in the Magic Valley, greater Twin Falls area. And then we also have a laboratory located in Utah, about 20 miles north of Salt Lake City. So our focus is we do work primarily with commercial producers. So my experience is mostly with cows, but and we work with large commercial dairies, but we also do work with raw milk producers, especially as that has ticked up over the last year and a half. We've had a real influx of people beginning to milk their own cow or goats with the beginning of the pandemic. And we also do work with large processors, almost entirely on the raw side of things. So we can do quantitative and qualitative bacterial counts on raw or finished product, although most of what we do is raw. Most of the work that we do is mastitis cultures. We do have some molecular techniques, PCR, bacterial speciation with a MALDI-TOF that we can offer, as well as food safety pathogen testing and environmental sample testing. So I wanted to just take a minute, and Dr. Wilson has kind of already done this, but just talk about mastitis in general terms for a minute. In terms of the larger dairy picture with commercial dairies, mastitis has been for many years and continues to be the most expensive disease in the industry, the most expensive animal health disease in that industry. Most of the money losses coming from discarded milk, loss of animals, antibiotic costs, losses in production from increased somatic cell count and loss of quality incentives. These animals may have experienced reduced production as a result of those high somatic cell counts, and it is extremely common. It is present in easily half of all dairy cows in the United States and on every farm. This includes even what we call homesteads or backyard raw milk productions. There's no reason that those situations would be immune from mastitis, so it is regardless of size. And although clinical mastitis is the one that is most easily recognized because of the presence of abnormal milk and sometimes the sick animal, it's really subclinical mastitis that's often the bigger issue. So if you're watching this and thinking, well, that's great, that affects commercial dairies, what does it have to do with you? That's where I want to dive in more about the different kinds of mastitis. So we've got a couple of pictures here. This vial on the right is a pretty obvious clinical mastitis. So we have clots, very abnormal milk. Any kind of color or blood or stringy or changes to milk would be considered abnormal milk. If you are shipping milk as part of the PMO, it is a violation of the pasteurized milk ordinance, which is the PMO, to put that milk in the tank for commercial sale. So it needs to be diverted. You may also see udder inflammation, In severe cases, you can have systemic symptoms such as decreased food and water intake. Cows and goats may go down and not want to stand up, have elevated temperature, things like that. At that point, it may require systemic antibiotics just to simply keep them alive. Those are extreme cases. More commonly, we're going to have mild clinical mastitis, so it may not be visible. They will not be systemically ill, maybe a few clots, but minimal changes in milk. And then most common is subclinical, and these are the hardest ones to find. So the animal, for all intents and purposes, looks fine, has no visible signs. They are still infectious. So in the last year and a half, we've all become very familiar with terms such as infectious and asymptomatic spread. This would be what subclinical mastitis behaves like. The animals frequently can spontaneously clear it on their own, but that is not always possible. So because subclinical mastitis is the larger problem, an average producer may think that he's doing well if he only sees a few clinical mastitis cases, when in reality, this may be a more accurate position of what's going on. So depending on what your herd size is, if you're only milking a small number of animals, then it'd be easier to stay on top of this. Whereas in the larger your herd goes, the harder it's going to be to keep track of those animals. Now, I will admit, as I said at the beginning, that most of my experience is with cows, but I did want to take a second to talk about the differences between goats and sheep, or goats versus sheep versus cows, as I know many of the producers on here. So this has already been touched on, but goats do have naturally higher somatic cells than cows do and than sheep do. So the FDA federal legal limit is 1 million cells per mil in goats, whereas it's 750,000 in cows and sheep. Now, many states have imposed, as Dr. Wilson mentioned, lower limits than that. So really what you should be focused on, not necessarily is what is the highest you can go, because that's not an ideal target, but what would be indication of good, healthy animal. And in goats, we'd like to see between 400 and 600,000 cells per mil. So doesn't necessarily mean that they're catastrophic and they're higher than that, but that's a good goal. That is probably going to be a very healthy goat. This doesn't apply to bacteria counts. So in all of these animals, we'd like to see, we'd like to have a goal of less than 10,000 CFU per mil, and CFU is colony forming units. So I will be talking a little bit more in depth about what in these different goals of bacteria counts come into play. But across the board, we do expect similar bacteria counts goals between the species. It's really just goats that have the higher somatic cell count. Sheep and cows are quite similar. So if you've been producing raw milk for a while, or if you're new to it, you may have experienced that there's lots of different types of tests that you will occur. So typical, I just want to go through some of them. So somatic cell count and standard plate count are probably the ones that you hear about the most, along with components, checking out the butter, fat, protein, lactose, solids, et cetera, it's in your milk, and then also mastitis culture. What you may be less familiar with is tests called an LPC, a lab pasteurized count, and a PIC, a preliminary incubation count. So I'm going to touch on those briefly as well. The biggest difference between these acronyms named tests, the standard plate count and SPC, LPC, PI, TC, all those that you may hear about, is that they are quantitative methods versus a mastitis culture, which is a qualitative. So the basis of quantitative methods is that they are supposed to be done the same way. They're regulated and should be done using standardized protocols, the same in every lab across the country. So many of these labs will be certified labs by the FDA IMS, which is Food and Drug Administration, of course, and interstate milk shippers. So our Jerome, Idaho lab is a certified lab by the FDA IMS. Each state, for the most part, usually has a certified lab. Private ones are less common, but that means that they are audited, they pass proficiency tests, they are performing these tests exactly as they're supposed to be done. And the idea is that it generates an accurate quantitative result in colony forming units of bacteria per ml of milk. It is also possible to run what is called an unofficial screening test with the same methods. And that simply means that the lab may be an uncertified lab, but still follows the same protocol, which is available in the standard methods book for examination of dairy products. So following those protocols, it just won't count as an official test. But there is things that need to be noted for goats. Specifically, one is while automated counters are becoming more and more commonly used to produce a somatic cell count, this is a problem. This is problematic for goats. It needs to be calibrated because of their different cell count population. And in addition to automated counters for somatic cell, automated bacteria counters are also becoming more common for the raw bacteria counts. This will generate different numbers between a Petri film and an automated count. So that is something to keep in mind if you're interpreting results and to be talking about with that lab or with your veterinarian. So I want to talk about somatic cell for a minute. This is probably the one that everybody's heard about, and Dr. Wilson already did a nice introduction of this. So these are leukocytes that fight infection in the udder, simply a white cell count. So it is indicative of mastitis level in a herd or in an animal. It's a natural defense mechanism of infection in the udder and can be used at the individual cow level to identify if there is a milk quality risk present. So as I said earlier, the federal legal limit in cows and in sheep is 750,000 cells per mil. It is higher for goats, up to 1 million. There are a number of states, Idaho is one of them, that have mandated a limit of 500,000 cells per mil. And if you are selling to a processor, many of those have imposed a 400,000 limit. That is to meet both the export requirements for European shipping and powders. And it's a good thing to keep in mind that somatic cells may be present in very high numbers, even if the milk does appear normal. So this is that subclinical mastitis. So if you assume that the milk is going to look abnormal with a high somatic cell count, that is not always the case. It's also good to know that there are effects of high CC. It almost always means an increased incidence of mastitis cases in a herd, whether those are clinical or subclinical. There will be production losses. So as the cell count climbs, you're going to be losing more and more milk. If you are treating with any antibiotics, you will be treating more cases. So you're going to have increased costs of antibiotics, and then of course the milk discard while those animals are sick. The standard plate count has many names, and this is another common one. One of the most common ones that you'll do as raw producers. It's also maybe called a plate loop count, a plate aerobic count, simply a raw count. It has a number of different names, but really what it is just a raw bacterial count in CFU per mil of milk. And this may elevation of these counts may come from animals, equipment, or procedures, maybe from insufficient wash of milking equipment. You may have old compromised rubber, seals, milking liners, hose, anything like that. If there's bacteria present in the milk and the milk is not cooled quickly enough, then you will have counts that will ramp up during that time. One thing we've seen a lot that can cause high bacterial counts is udder washing. So too much water on the udder that can then run down, carrying soils, fecal content, dirt, down into the milking liner can cause bacteria counts. This will also cause high total coliform counts. Inadequate teat cleaning. So what I mean by that is using towels that are dirty, using sponges, not using individual cow towels, too much water left on the teat. At times, milking your animals, not wearing gloves. There are bacteria on our hands that we carry that can be transferred to the teat skin. plastic buckets that have scratches or compromises in the surface and can't be properly disinfected. These are all reasons. Troubleshooting bacteria counts can be very tricky. So there may, because part of it is differentiating, is it coming from the cow or is it coming from the machine? It may be a combination of both. So troubleshooting that often requires the help of a milk quality specialist. But these are different things that we see it come from. The federal legal limit is 100,000 CFU per mil of milk, but for raw milk production, really a good goal would be less than 10,000 CFU per milk. So total coliform, along with standard plate count, is the other probably the most common milk quality test that is done with raw milk producers and basically all goat and cow milk producers. And it's generally an indicative of cleanliness of the milking procedure. So if we have a teat or an udder that looks like the one in the picture here, and it's not being properly cleaned, it's pretty clear that that would obviously be sucked into the liner and could be into the milk. The udder washing that I mentioned, water running down the udder, carrying any kind of soils on the teat or on the udder skin. It's not necessary to wash the whole udder, and I don't recommend it. It really should just be the teats that are cleaned. More water is not a good thing, or if you are using a lot of water, you need to make sure that you're thoroughly drying all surfaces before putting the milking liner on. Total coliform is a quantitative test, so it does not differentiate between E. coli and other coliforms. So there are other coliforms called Klebsiella that may be present. This test will just give a total count. It'll also not differentiate exactly which ones are E. coli. There are a number of different goals out there from different states. Some say less than 10 CFU per mil. Some may be less than 25. A good goal is less than 15 CFU per mil. Just always, this is extremely applicable to raw milk producers. And I just want to pause here that I realize not everyone in this audience may be raw milk producers, but in my experience, many of the goat and sheep producers that we've been working with have been doing raw milk, which is why I keep referring to that. So oftentimes we won't have the advantage of pasteurization on your side. So I want to cover two tests just quickly because these will not be applicable to most of the producers here. The lab pasteurized count, LPC, this is a quantitative test looking for thermogenic organisms in the milk. It's very applicable to people that are pasteurizing milk because these are organisms that can survive extreme heat by producing spores. So this test is really looking for spore formers. It's frequently used as a test on milk that is intended to be made into powder. These spores become dangerous when powder is reconstituted into milk after export or shipping. It is not terribly applicable to most of the producers in this audience, is my guess, but if any of you are pasteurizing milk, this would be a relevant test, and it can be elevated by dirty equipment or milking procedures. Usually does not elevate it by animal health pathogens. The other one that is rare for goat and raw milk producers, but is applicable, is the preliminary incubation count, PIC. So this is a quantitative test looking for psychotrophic organisms. These are bacteria that can survive and multiply at refrigeration temperatures. Usually this comes from, it's a common spoilage organism. It usually comes from some kind of equipment or washing problem. If there's improper milking, hygiene, water quality issues, pipeline that's not being cleaned properly, these are all common sources. But this can also cause very spiked bacteria counts if there's slow cooling. So in most situations, putting finished product into a fridge is not going to be enough to cool it fast enough. You may need to put it into a freezer briefly to drop the temperature faster. And if you aren't running it through a plate cooler, that can result in high PI counts. This is often a post-pasteurization contamination issue in finished pasteurized products. Again, not common with raw milk and goat producers, but would be applicable as a spoilage organism at refrigeration temperatures. And then the last one that I want to cover is mastitis culture. I like to think of it, and in one way to think of it is in either two buckets, contagious or environmental. So one of the contagious pathogens that we focus on for dairy cows are Staph aureus, strep bag, mycoplasma, and prototheca. Prototheca has historically can be considered an environmental pathogen, which it still is. However, we've also learned that it can spread cow-to-cow transmission. In most goat and small operating situations, strep bag, mycoplasma, and prototheca are not going to be an issue. I have not seen those pathogens. I have yet to find a goat with mycoplasma, same as what Dr. Wilson says. We haven't seen it. Staph aureus, on the other hand, absolutely, probably one of the biggest problems we see with chronic mastitis cows and chronic ICC. The other one would be coliforms in the environmental category. Coliforms are present everywhere in the environment. They will always be an issue and will need to be mitigated by procedures and cleaning. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Dr. Wilson had a good example of that. It's not terribly common, low prevalence, but can be very damaging when it does show up. So these are the two things that, these are kind of the two buckets that we look for mastitis cultures. Why would you want to culture animals for mastitis if they don't appear that they are having any issues? The reason would be is making sure that they are doing well, that their production is where it can be, is optimized, that they're not harboring any subclinical mastitis. Really the comfort and well-being of the animal, and in some severe cases, mortality, as this can be fatal. So the scope of service, just to talk about mastitis culture and other things, other diagnostics in the dairy environment is pretty broad. You can go, these levels I have here are arbitrary levels named by Outer Health Systems. This is not universal, but you can do anything from simple tests to differentiating gram-positives to gram-negatives, to screening for just the main contagious pathogens, all the way up to what we call level 2 or level 3, which is looking for virtually everything in the cow and in her environment. So any kind of environmental or contagious organisms, looking for specifically for rare and low prevalence organisms, speciation, and then any environmental testing. So water, teat dips, towels, bedding. These tests are not done comically. This is what you would be doing if you're trying to troubleshoot bacteria count issues. They tend to be more involved, more expensive. They're not necessary most of the time, but can be helpful if there are animals, if you're having a lot of new mastitis cases, a lot of bacteria count problems, trying to identify where those things came from and getting them resolved. Different than the quantitative tests that I was talking about before is we do mastitis culture on what is called old school microbiology. So we do Petri dishes, and we are actually identifying organisms based off their morphology and biochemical reactions. So whereas SBC, SCC, TC, LPC, PIC, all of those quantitative methods, those are all done on Petri film. They are not differentiated by species. They are differentiated simply by counts and type. We are speciating and looking at the actual identification of bacteria. So this is good because it's an inexpensive, sensitive method. We can target specific organisms, can be done in a combination of different lab environments, depending on what you're looking for. And there are ways to hone in on those detections by using different selective augers. The bad is it's not terribly easy for everyone to do this. Requires a lot of training. The turnaround time can be slow at times, depending on what you're looking for. In some cases, the specificity can be quite low. You're able to grow it on culture, but you'll need a fancier method such as PCR or other bacterial speciation to identify it. And it can be time-consuming and labor-intensive, which translates to cost for the lab and or for the producer trying to get those tests. So moving back to raw milk production, or just looking at the differences between pasteurized and raw. So a good bulk tank somatic cell goal is less than 200,000 cells per mil. And this would be for cows. For goats, obviously, it's going to run higher than that. Between 400 and 6,000 would be good goals. Ideally, you want to see a bacteria count goal less than 20,000 CFU per mil. Total coliform tests are not done very commonly in pastures and commercial dairies, but LPCs and PICs are done commonly. And this really has to do with the use of the pasteurization and what the milk product is going to be used for. And then, of course, all finished product is tested for public health pathogens as required by the FDA. For raw milk, I would recommend a bacteria count goal of less than 10,000. You don't have the advantage of pasteurizing that milk if you are going to consume it or sell it raw. So really, I think that a goal of less than 10,000 is a good one. As I said, we work with a lot of large commercial dairies. We have dairies of 2, 3, 4,000 cows, even more, that are regularly achieving bacteria count goals of less than 10,000. So this is not an unrealistic goal. This is something that is absolutely achievable, I believe, by probably everyone in this audience. As I mentioned earlier, good total coliform goal would be less than 15. You would want to maintain negative culture for contagious pathogens, keeping your animals safe, and then routinely testing for common food safety pathogens. Just a note that I realized that as of recently, the testing regulations in Idaho have been removed. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why you would want to keep testing and going for these goals despite having those regulations removed. So I'm just going to touch briefly on food safety pathogens. It's not really the focus of this talk, but it is real and it is something that should be of concern for raw milk producers. So the bacteria that I have listed on the left here, down at the bottom, we have brucellosis and tuberculosis. Those are still required to be tested annually, as our former speaker touched on, but these others are not required, and these are low prevalence, but they are as all associated with raw milk production, and they are invisible. You will not be able to see necessarily in the milk if these are present, which animal or which glass of milk, so to speak, is in this picture has those pathogens. It does require a properly accredited lab. So our Jerome, Idaho lab is ISO 17025 accredited. It is the most common accreditation for food testing labs. There are other food testing labs, private and food testing labs available that can offer these kind of tests. Really, the requirements that they have to meet are part of FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act requirements, and that's what these ISO accreditations demand. The testing, I am not a food science expert, so as I said, I'm going to give an overview on this, but the testing is quite a bit more involved than what we do for mastitis cultures and quantitative milk testing. Any positives that are found will be reported as preliminary and will require additional testing to confirm, and that's nearly always a different method that is usually more expensive, more involved. Why should you test for these pathogens when it's unlikely that you'll have them? The low prevalence they are low prevalence, so it's very rare. You will be hopefully negative for any of these for your entire milking career. However, outbreaks, you hear about them of Salmonella, Campylobacter, Listeria. They do happen. They are a big deal. They will put you in the news. They are very high consequence. They are a public health risk. I would highly recommend that anybody that is producing raw milk and selling to the public be testing for these pathogens. So moving on, so why should you test? You're no longer, at least in the state of Idaho, you're no longer required to. And really the biggest reason at the top of the list, in my opinion, is safety. Raw milk, before pasteurization was invented, dairy products were responsible for about 25% of all foodborne illnesses. Granted, that's 100 years ago. We've become very comfortable that dairy products are safe. Pasteurization is an amazing tool. And raw milk absolutely can be safe if produced that way, but it can also present a public health risk. And knowledge of production of a safe product is key. You may not always know if your product is safe. High counts of coliforms, of bacteria, presence of certain pathogens, they will not always be obvious. You will not always know if your milk is clean or if your animals are healthy. I have worked with producers many times that had no idea that they had bacteria count problems. This also provides protection and assurance for the consumers if you're selling to consumers directly or through a small store. Quality, knowledge that your animals, your procedures, and your equipment is all sound. Again, it may not be obvious that there are issues. If there are, then it's easier to address them. It's the ones that are not obvious that are more difficult to address. And the third reason would be animal health. Mastitis is an extremely painful and damaging disease, and ruminants are pretty impressive creatures. They can really put on a brave face and bear out a lot of discomfort from mastitis without us necessarily knowing. So whether it's sheep or goats or cows, subclinical mastitis may be affecting their health, their production, and you may never know. It may be treatable, so the cows or the goats or sheep don't necessarily need to be sold for slaughter. They're not necessarily ruined, and oftentimes it is preventable. So knowledge is key on learning these things. So I want to move on to how do I test, because this may be a question that some local audience members may have. We developed at Udder Health Systems our Homestead program. This applies mostly to smaller producers. We have more appropriate testing options for larger herds, but for smaller producers, because we had such an influx of demand last year at the beginning of the pandemic with people beginning to produce their own milk, whether it's goats or cows, that we created this Homestead program. It comes with an introductory kit that will contain all of your sampling materials that you need to get going, including an insulated styrofoam cooler, sampling files, instructions. We will send that to you with a return shipping label, and also consultation. Filling out an intake form, which is done at our website, and then speaking with, you'll be contacted by an Udder Health Systems associate. Now, I want to clarify, we're a small family business. This is not a sea of people. So when I say an Udder Health Systems associate, it will be one of 3 people. So don't worry about endless faces. It'll be myself or 2 of my coworkers that will be contacting you. And they will walk you through your intake form, what the process goes, what tests may be applicable. Our standard recommendation is the SBC-TC and then often somatic cell. But there are situations where if an animal is experiencing mastitis, or you just want to know, have that peace of mind, we can include that. Or if you're trying to troubleshoot high counts or quality issues that you're having, then working on figuring out where those are coming from and what the solutions would be. Once tests are complete, the consultation will include results interpretation, and then of course sampling and shipping instructions are included in all this. So I want to spend just a minute talking about logistics. All sampling should be collected post-milking. So you would prep the udders and milk as normal. You would not apply any post-dip. Once you're done milking, wiping teat ends with disposable alcohol wipes. Those come with any tubes you may buy, or you can also just simply put alcohol on cotton balls and wipe the teat end. You don't need that much milk for a mastitis culture, so good 3 to 5 pulls from each quarter or udder half into the sterile vials provided by Udder Health. Avoiding touching the vial to the ends of the teats is enough for mastitis culture. You do want to freeze the samples completely before shipping them. So once your samples are collected, you place them in the freezer. If you are sampling finished product, you'll want to make sure that all of your straining and chilling steps are complete. Most people that we've worked with are storing their milk in glass bottles. So after you've strained the milk and chilled it, pour directly from its storage vessel into a sterile vial that we provided. Freeze again and make sure that they're frozen completely before shipping. There may be questions about if freezing damages the bacteria. or the SMAG cells? The answer is yes, a small number will die. It's not enough to be consequential. It's much more important that we get the samples cold and in good condition. If the bacteria counts are high enough that it's a problem, this freezing will not mask that. And if they are low enough, then they will remain low. All shipping should be done with completely frozen samples. Boxes need to be shipped overnight via only UPS or FedEx, not the Postal Service. Postal Service has not been able to get stuff to us consistently on time. So absolutely do not use them, as well as not shipping on Fridays or Saturdays. We recommend trying to do Monday through Wednesday if possible. Thursday overnight shipping should work, but we've had a lot of trouble, especially over the last year and a half, with packages getting diverted and then getting stuck over the weekend. So beginning of the week is best. Refrigeration is okay if you're local and planning on just dropping the samples off the next day, as long as they remain cold. Shipping labels can be obtained through Water Health Systems. We are not covering shipping costs. However, we do have about a 50% discount off normal rates, which we do pass on to our customers. So that will save you a decent amount of money. We do have a portal coming soon to our website where you can obtain your own label after you've gone through the process of the intake form and all that. So we try to help with the shipping as much as possible. It does end up being, the shipping can be expensive and can be kind of a pain with logistics. We're trying to help with that. Once we've received your sample, most samples can be turned around in 48 hours. There are some mastitis cultures and specialty tests will go up to 72. We do all reports electronically, so give an email report. And as I mentioned before, follow-up consultation, go through the results interpretation, troubleshooting of any high counts, etc. And once we've got you established as a customer, we can make adjustments to your testing plan as needed, as situations change, and just ensure that you're on an annual test and udder health plan that suits your needs. So to wrap up, really the best thing that testing is going to offer is knowledge. The one thing I like to say, it's very cliche, it's kind of Yogi Bearism is you don't know what you don't know. You are ensuring low quality counts if you're obtaining that knowledge or being alerted to problems. Keeping mastitis, contagious mastitis out of your herd and ensuring that the product is free of public health pathogens. This is a safety issue and what I believe is a responsibility issue. So understanding the difference between quantitative raw counts versus qualitative, which is mastitis cultures, and then just auditing your system for making sure that your processes in animal health is as best it can be. So thank you everyone for hanging on for the last speaker. Feel free to take any questions now that anyone has.
Okay, thank you for that presentation, Justine. I found it very informational, and I do have a couple questions. So when you were talking about the total coliform, do you guys notice any like seasonality with that? Like, are they lower in the summer and higher in the winter when we have more snow and mud, or does that not seem to impact it as much?
Typically, or historically, I should say, mastitis is higher late summer. And July and August, many ruminants do better with cold than they do with heat. But there's not necessarily a ton of seasonal flux with mastitis that, in my experience, unless we really have extreme weather events, that can change. By that, I mean, a few years ago when we had that really heavy snow year, and there was a lot of cold, there may be a delay when you have extreme weather events like that. If there's frostbite on teats, that may not play out for a few months. So there may be a delay sometimes when there's extreme weather events, but if your procedures are sound, then the weather shouldn't impact it too much. And also I'm looking at the chat here, and Scott fact checked me on the Idaho SMAG cell. I was thinking that it was 400,000, but then I found something that said 500,000. So I apologize for that.
Oh, you're good. Okay, that helps. And then I had a question. So you were talking about the LPC and how it's not really applicable to raw milk. And is that, I guess I wanted more explanation of that. Is that part of the pasteurization process that those spores are activated? Or I guess how does that impact the milk?
It is. So bacteria that are spore formers, it is a survival mechanism. They will form spores as a result of that heat stress. The spores can stay in a vegetative state. That then, if the milk is, so this is a common problem with milk powders, which are dried at an extremely high temperature. But if there are some spores that will survive that process. If the milk is reconstituted at a later time and there's any quality issues in the powder and or any quality issues in the water it's being reconstituted with, then you can have spoilage issues.